Hi, and welcome to our Survive and Thrive webinar series. My name is Natalie O'Rourke, and I'm with the Texas Oncology Foundation. For those of you who are new with us, our foundation is dedicated to providing support to cancer patients and caregivers in the communities where they live, work, and receive treatment. You can visit texasoncologyfoundation.org for additional resources and ways to support our programs. Through our Survive and Thrive programming, the Foundation focuses on survivorship skills and wellness issues for cancer survivors, loved ones, and caregivers. Today, we are excited to have Tani Bahti to discuss the myths regarding grief and loss. I've known Tani for 10 years, and each time she presents, I take away such valuable information. She is truly passionate and has a gift for talking about the hard stuff. So before she gets started, I would like to turn this over to Kelly Condon, our program coordinator, and she will provide some housekeeping items and additional information about Tani. Kelly?
Thank you, Natalie, and welcome to all of you who have joined us live today. We're so excited you're here with us. Like Natalie said, I'm just going to give you some helpful housekeeping tips for this Zoom platform. If this is your first time using Zoom, please be reassured as an attendee, we cannot hear or see you, but you can hear and see us. If you're having technical difficulties, the best solution is typically just to exit and rejoin the webinar session. If you're experiencing any audio issues, you can always dial in to listen from a phone line, and this dial-in option was provided on the registration confirmation email you received. If you have questions during this presentation, we encourage you to send them in to us. We want to know your thoughts and your questions throughout the entire presentation. If you hover over your Zoom screen, you will see along the bottom, or sometimes it's along the top, but there's a Q&A tool. You can click on that, type in your questions, and they will be delivered directly to us. We are not going to stop Tani during her presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the very end. So stay tuned for that. And like I said, send in those questions, send in those comments. We would love to hear from you. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded. The online archive is going to be emailed out to all registrants after this live version. So you will be receiving that in your email. You are also able to find it on our Texas Oncology Foundation website as well. As Natalie said, we have Tani Bahti here with us today. And Tani has been a nurse for 44 years now, and she has focused primarily on improving end-of-life care. And so we are looking forward to just getting some insights from her experience today. Tani, thank you for taking time to share with us, and I know I've been looking forward to hearing from you. So I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Great. Well, thank you. I can't imagine there's anyone on the line today who hasn't experienced a loss that kind of rips your heart out, you know, whether it's loss of relationships or home or jobs, etc. But I'll be focusing today on the losses and grief related to advancing illness and also death and dying. Not much fun. And dealing with the loss is painful. And frankly, I don't like to deal with losses personally myself, so I just want to get that back on the table. This is not easy stuff. Now, we know with losses, people need to grieve. You know, it's not an enemy to be avoided, it's a healing path to be walked. But by gosh, I don't want to walk that path. I don't know where it's going. I don't know how long it is. I don't know what to pack. I don't know what's normal. It's not easy very often because we haven't been taught how to grieve and how to move down that healing path and what that path might start to look like. And here's the bad news, good news, but there's no way out of the desert except through it. So we have to look at how do we get through it. We all do it in very different ways. And to begin with, let's look at ourselves and our families of origin and how we were taught how to grieve. Now, this was my family. Basically, you didn't talk about death and dying. You didn't talk about loss. You certainly didn't show emotion or tears. It was all very hush-hush. If somebody died, it happened to be whispered, and I wasn't allowed to ask about that. You sucked it up, you moved on, you pretended nothing happened. That was considered a show of strength. So you can imagine that when I was 17 and experienced the suicide of my father, that coping style ended up being very difficult for me. So grief is really difficult because even though we all share it, something universally, we can feel very alone in our pain. Again, depending on how you were raised. And how I was raised, because you didn't share it, you really were feeling very alone and not sure how to manage that. So what do you do with your emotions? So what I learned, to shield it. I hid behind a shield. No emotions were going to get through to me. No issues were going to get through to me. I had to continue to look strong. I had to fight that grief and loss. And I didn't want to be seen as being abnormal. I needed to say I was okay in the face of adversity. So if someone says, "How are you doing?" I did the very common reaction of, "I'm fine." Yeah, really, I'm fine. Feelings inside not expressed, but really, I'm fine. How many of you have done the same thing? Because the fear is, what if someone found out I'm not fine? Oh my God, this is not normal. I'm in new territory. What are they going to think about me? So we start getting into self-judgment and comparing. We look around and we think, well, gee, everyone else seems to be coping well because we don't know what's happening behind the scenes with them. They don't seem to be crying. They seem to be engaged in life. Maybe they don't have the depth of emotion that I have. One is going to have a very unique path for how you're going to walk in grieving. So let's talk about the work of grief. It forever changes your world. And you've experienced losses, you know that. It redefines your priorities. Wow, should I be spending more time at home, or should I be reaching out to my grandparents more, less time at work? It may increase your spiritual awareness. Hopefully it will also strengthen your compassion. But it also increases the awareness of our mortality and those around us, and that increases our sense of vulnerability. So when we experience the death of somebody, maybe not even our own family, suddenly we get worried of, whoa, if it can happen to them, it could happen to me. Well, of course it's going to happen to us, but we kind of keep it at a distance, but the reality kind of hits us in the face when it comes close. So the opportunity is for us to live more consciously with that knowledge of, how do I live better each day? And I'm going to be ending the program with how you can work with that a little bit. So let's talk about the continuum of the journey of grief, because grief and loss doesn't begin at the time of death. It begins at the time of diagnosis. And any of you who've had a diagnosis that's difficult, you know that the losses begin there, because you've got present changes in health and you've got some anticipated losses. So it's really important. Name the losses, grieve the losses. It may be a loss of health. It may be a loss of your role in the family, a loss of independence. It may be a loss of your dreams. Gosh, I was just going to travel the world right now. I can't do that. A loss of your sexuality, a loss of perceived value and meaning. There's plenty of losses that people will feel when they have a difficult diagnosis. And grieving the losses doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean anything other than the fact that you are allowed to grieve those losses. I don't expect you to only think positive thoughts. You need to be able to grieve before you can move forward. Now, sometimes those losses include physical losses, loss in body parts. Now, you're still a whole person even if you've lost parts, but you may not feel that whole. A study in the British Medical Journal relates the idea of losing a body part is very similar to losing a person to death. It's your own little deaths. And I thought that was really interesting, because just as we're uncomfortable revealing our emotions for fear of judgment because of who are we now that somebody has died, we also have that fear of revealing our bodies. And they say it's a relearning process, kind of similar to when a person loses a body part, you have to learn how to live and do normal activities again, be comfortable in your new body. A grieving person has to learn how to live without the other person. So the grief and loss truly is the same. So first step, acknowledge the grief. Give yourself permission to grieve. Not an easy thing, because again, for some people, this seems like new territory. And even if you don't give yourself permission, guess what? Your body's going to tell off on you. So physical manifestations of grief, be aware of for yourself or people around you. They may start sleeping too much or sleeping too little, eating too much, eating too little, joint pain, develop symptoms of the person who was ill, forgetfulness, irritability, stomach or chest pain, weakness, overactive, less than active, panic attacks, impaired immune system. All of these things are physical manifestations of grief, which may give you some insights if you're starting to observe it in yourself or observing it in the people around you. But in addition to the physical manifestations, there's also the emotional manifestations. It's not just sadness. It can be denial. It can show as withdrawal, guilt, acting out, feeling just numb, like you're walking around like a zombie. Depression, blaming, distancing, helplessness, and anger. And I left anger for last because anger is very, very common. But I also have to admit that I used anger just last week. And I had to acknowledge that that is part of the grief. My brother was diagnosed with a very virulent spreading cancer. And he had had the surgery. He should have had the surgery 3 months ago, and it did not. So after I was totally devastated with the news, I became very angry with the fact that he was not diagnosed sooner and intervened sooner. Now, anger isn't all bad. Sometimes it's a protective. Anger sometimes can be a mobilizer. When I was angry about my brother not having his surgery months ago, I could stay focused on what can't be changed, which is why he didn't have surgery months ago. But I can use the anger now to focus on what I can do. So it can be a mobilizer. Now, when we are feeling a loss, we feel helpless and powerless, and we're going to search for something to control, right? Anyone else like control out there? So again, not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be challenging. Sometimes the control is, oh my gosh, I feel so out of control with this diagnosis that I'm going to be more demanding on my spouse or my children. But it also can be a positive. It could be that we're looking to control, saying, okay, I'm going to deal with my diet, I'm going to deal with my exercise, I'm going to look at support groups, I'm going to look at prayer chains, whatever. So not necessarily a bad thing, but certainly a common dynamic. Next step after acknowledging the grief is simply sharing your grief. So there's Pig saying, hold me, make my problems go away. It says, you dumb pig, problems don't go away because somebody holds you. Problems never go away. And he says, hold me anyway. I love Pig. Okay, so find out who is your person. You kind of feel safe, and chances are it's going to be somebody who expresses grief the same way that you are, because that's where we're going to be obviously more comfortable. When I first started my nursing career, because of what I learned about not expressing grief, you can bet how uncomfortable I was when I ran into families who were very expressive and crying and wailing. I've since learned how to be with that, but just be aware that we all have our different ways of expressing grief, and you find somebody who matches, because you have to feel safe. And it's a little bit funny. I can remember that there are people in my life that don't like tears. And so if I cry at soppy movies, which I do, they'll look at me and go, ha ha, are you crying? Well, I don't need that. So what I've learned is if I'm sitting next to somebody like that, and they're sitting on my right side, the tear will go down the left side of my cheek, so they don't see it. I don't need to deal with them. So find somebody that you're safe and talk, because this is going to be critical for your journey. There is a sacredness in those tears. I love Washington Irving. He says, they're not the mark of weakness, but a power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are messengers of overwhelming grief and unspeakable love. How do we get comfortable in sharing the tears? So let me tell you a story. And this is a story from Joan, who is a fellow hospice nurse. And she was working with Frank B. Now, Frank was in his 40s, and he was adored by friends, families, peers, etc. And they were devastated that he was dying. He was now bedbound in his bedroom. So people would visit every day, and they'd come into his room, one or two at a time, and they'd talk, and they'd laugh, and they'd share stories, etc. But when the friends left the room and joined each other in the living room, they'd fall into each other's arms in tears because they were so devastated that this man was dying. So one day, Joan came for a routine hospice visit and found Frank really upset. And he said, look, nobody cares that I'm dying. And she says, really? Why would you say that? He says, nobody has shed a single tear. So sharing of tears, it simply shows your heart. I've already warned my kids. I said, if I have a deathbed experience and you're at my bed, I said, I need to see some tears here. Or if I was at their deathbed in a hospital, I don't want the nurses or physicians or anybody around who's stoic. If they have tears in their eyes, I know they get how incredible this experience is and how painful it is, and it becomes a shared experience. So please don't be afraid of the tears, because if tears are a very useful tool, because when you show your tears, sometimes it gives permission for the other people to express their fear and share their tears too. You become authentic, you become mutually vulnerable. You share this experience in a way that feels so authentic. So what about supporting others in their grief? Well, it's being present. Now that sounds simple, it's only 2 words, but this is really tough because it is so painful, because it's going to be triggering your own losses and fears also. I love this statue because it shows the emptiness that people feel when they are in grief. And that's exactly what it does feel like. There are no magic words. So if you turned into this thinking I was going to give you some magic words for getting through grief, sorry. But there is magic in the power of your presence. And that's really what's most critical at this point. Just your presence. So look at this example. Look at this gentleman. There's nothing you can do to change the horror of what's happening. You can't take away his pain. But to be present in the midst of profound powerlessness, that's amazing. But you can imagine it's not easy to be present with this, but to be quiet, to sit with them, to hand on the shoulder, that's pretty amazing. So Rachel Naomi Remen is a physician and also has a chronic illness. She's wonderful with her books. She says, listen, just listen. Perhaps the most important thing ever to give each other is our attention. A loving silence is often far more power to heal and connect than most well-intentioned words. And she's right. Think about when you're going through some bad times. Did you want somebody to fill the space with their ideas, or did you need them to simply be quiet and be present? So let's talk about some things you can do for being a healing presence. Like Dr. Drummond said, silence is golden. Don't feel the need to fill the space. Allow the person who is grieving to decide when they want to share or fill that space. Being helpless is not easy, so if you need to say something, it's okay to say, I wish I had words to take away your pain, because that's true. But then be quiet again. Allow them to feel that pain. Then you can be inquiring at one point to help them give voice to their pain. What has this been like for you? Tell me more about that as they're sharing memories and concerns, because as they tell their stories, they're actually grieving some of their losses, and that's of tremendous value. But please, no comparing, no I understand completely. Just like the previous slide, even if you also lost a little girl, your circumstances were different than them, your relationships are different. You can't say I understand completely because we're simply not in their shoes. No competing stories. This is being present with them. No saying, well, so-and-so lost 3 children in a car accident just like that. That doesn't help the person who's grieving. You need to be present just with them in that moment and nobody else. And please, no advice. They're not going to hear it, but any of these stories or advice or filling the air sometimes will shut down communication totally with that person. So again, practicing silence or just say, I'm here, is golden. And while there are no magic words to heal, there are words that can hurt. And I'm guessing that you'll know a lot of these. Say, he's in a better place. Oh, really? But he's not here with me. You know, that doesn't help me. You can have another child. Okay, I don't even need to say anything about that. God needed another angel. It was God's will. Well, chances are people are already pretty angry with God sometimes. But to say that again, what that does is it shuts down communication. It kind of summarizes and said, that's enough. You don't have the right to grieve. because it was God's will. She's no longer suffering. That may be true, but now I'm the one suffering because she's gone. Be grateful for the time you shared. Be strong. Everything happens for a reason. These are platitudes that are more likely to block communication. The intention may be good, and some of these things may even be true, but it doesn't matter. It stops the intention. And very often we say these because we don't know what else to say. So that's why silence is golden. So let's talk about the truths about grief. Sorry, bad news here. There is no right way to grieve, and there is no one way to grieve. Everybody has their own way. We can't take away another person's grief. Oh boy, do we wish we could, but we do not have access to that magic wand. And nobody gets over it. And this is one of, I think, the most damaging myths that are out there is about getting over grief. We talk about closure. I've even seen it with terrorist attacks or some personal deaths that leaders come together, well-meaning, saying, okay, it's time to heal, time to come together. The day after, excuse me, it's not time to move forward. It's time to feel the grief and the pain and what it means to you. Allow time for that before you pick up and move forward. It's not neat and tidy. Sometimes there's more interest in finding closure than finding meaning because, again, people are uncomfortable and don't know what to do with somebody's grief. They want to seal it up and move on. And I get that. It would be easier, but that's not being human. So we don't move on from grief, we move forward with it. Norm McGurney has a wonderful TED Talk on that. It'll always be a part of your life. You're always going to travel with it. And that's why I put the road with potholes. Sometimes the road is smooth, sometimes it's a little bumpy, sometimes it's a little jarring, and sometimes it feels like it swallows you whole. You'll always get out of it. But it is a journey that you're going to be taking for the rest of your life. So here's more truths about grieving. The pain of grief is much longer and harder than you ever thought possible. And there is no timetable for grieving. Now, I'm going to try and get through the next story without sobbing, but I always choke up. I don't know how many of you heard this story. Gosh, it had to have been at least 10 years ago now. As Telequa's, if that's pronounced properly, Tour of Grief. This was a 20-year-old female killer whale. She gave birth to a female calf who lived just 30 minutes before she died. Now, she had was pregnant for 17 months, so she bonded with that baby and then had 30 minutes of life. Now, she kept the body of the baby at the surface, supporting it on her head and holding it in her mouth. Killer whales have been observed for doing this with their dead, but usually not longer than a day. But she did this for 17 days. She traveled 1,000 miles supporting her baby, and the researcher called it the Tour of Grief. It was just a wonderful reminder that everybody does it differently, the length of time. Now, when she finally let the baby go, does that mean her grief ended? No, absolutely not. It just meant that at that moment, she let the body of the baby go. That's all. So there is no timetable for grief. It's whatever it is for you. I know people talk about the 5 stages of grief. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And it would be wonderful if it happened in order and in a timely fashion, and you were done in, months, 6 months, a year, whatever. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. Here's the reality. You're back and forth between all of those stages. Maybe you only stay in one stage. Maybe you go through all 5 stages several times in a single hour. It is messy. It is crazy making. It is not an easy thing. So here's the kind of bottom line for all of that. Grief is messy. It's not orderly, it's unpredictable. So give up trying to do it right and repeat this mantra. I'm not going to get through this looking good. And that's okay. I'm normal. I think it's not stages, but waves. Sometimes it's just gentle waves of grief rocking in and out. You're aware, you're sad, but you're moving on. You're continuing on with life. Sometimes there's a larger wave, but you can ride it pretty good. You knew it was coming, you've got the support, etc. Later, I woke up and just started to sob. And I realized that was my 18th birthday, and he wasn't there to say, "Happy birthday, Pumpkinhead." I was devastated. I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And of course, I didn't share it with anybody because I thought there was something very abnormal about that. So something was wrong with me. Why was it delayed? Why was it so late? Maybe this was just selfish. A lot of self-judgment comes about that. But that's what happens. And sometimes it's not about a particular loss, but it's also about the cumulative losses. So for example, I heard the example of each loss that you have in your life, it's like you start stacking up boxes. And sometimes when you stack up a box, they all come tumbling down on your head. And you're a basket case. You wonder what happened. Why is that? I mean, this loss was just the neighbor lost their hamster. Why am I crying like this? Well, it's because you're experiencing the other losses. It tumbles down because those losses, they were never gone. They were just out of sight for a while. It does give you new opportunity to understand or find meaning in those losses or to appreciate and move on. Is it fun? Absolutely not. But it is normal. Now I think, well, what about professionals? Do they have it more together in grieving? No, we're just like you. Now I do have to say, I do believe that to be a healer, you have to wear your heart on your sleeve. But in doing so, that means we're vulnerable and we recognize that you are no different than us and that we feel your pain also. And how we process that pain, because we may be experiencing more of it through the people we serve, can be a challenge. So let me talk about Dr. C. Dr. C was the oncologist who had the reputation for treating aggressively for so long that the joke was that he still gave chemotherapy even when somebody was in rigor mortis. He hated hospice. If he saw you as a hospice nurse during referral, he came and ripped you up one side and down the other. So you were always kind of nervous when you had one of his patients that another physician had referred. So sure enough, I got called in to do a referral on one of his patients, and I could feel Dr. C coming up behind me. And I grew very stiff and my hackles went up and I just braced myself for the assault. But then I decided to take a little different approach. I looked at him and I said, help me understand what it must be like for you to have all these wonderful patients, but then they die. And he stopped in his tracks and he paused, and then the story came out. He talked about a patient that he had gone very close to for 30 years, in and out, multiple medical issues, to death's door and back again, many times. Dr. C loved this patient because doctors, healthcare professionals, we get very attached. Well, one time Dr. C was on vacation and the patient went into a medical crisis and died. Dr. C was devastated and he ended up with very unresolved grief. And he felt, okay, there's something I missed, there's something I didn't do. I am not going to let anybody else die on my watch. I'm going to make sure that they get treated, to get everything they need. And that's why he began to overtreat patients. And after he told his story, he began to cry. Wow. I just stood there in silence. And a minute later, he said, I'm glad you're here. Get him to hospice. We have to show compassion for each other because we don't know how other healthcare professionals have responded to cumulative grief. It's not easy. So exploring what those issues are and what their stories are is really important for us, really working as a team and seeing ourselves as fellow human beings. They did study oncologists and found out reactions to losses could be withdrawal or distancing because it's too painful. I can't be attached anymore. It's too painful when they die. Compartmentalization, or they could also work to improve care, work harder to avoid death, which is what he did. And hopefully they can also show greater appreciation for life. So not much different than anybody else, right? So the grief reactions of professionals, we have to look at, it's not our family, but maybe it's triggering our own losses or our future losses. So it scares us, we grieve. Maybe there's an incongruence between our perception of a good death and what happened. Boy, we really wanted to get him off that ventilator and home again, and it didn't happen. Maybe it's because we didn't prepare ourselves or our families, and it came as a surprise. And therefore, we didn't get the closure we needed. So understanding the grief, especially when we have multiple losses, sometimes the demand of work can overshadow our ability to grieve, and we can just ignore it. But not for long, because it's always going to come up anyway. And grief can accumulate, so we can feel more vulnerable. And it is the leading cause of burnout for healthcare professionals is grief, unrelieved grief. So Rachel Remen again. People who don't care are rarely vulnerable to burnout. We burn out not because we don't care, but because we don't grieve. Because we've allowed our hearts to become so filled with loss that we have no room left to care. So we have to find ways of obtaining our own closure, whether it's facilitating, quote, the good death, whether it's getting them home, making sure they're comfortable, etc. But also communicating, acknowledging the end of life, and saying goodbye. Now, the saying goodbye for a lot of folks is like, no, I can't do that. But by acknowledging who that patient has been for you is a way of saying goodbye. Like, every time I see a rose, I'm going to think of you because you're a master gardener. Or my favorite memory of you is. Or the funniest thing I remember about you is. Or what I learned from you is. That's a way of acknowledging them and saying goodbye and getting closure without actually saying goodbye, I'm sorry you're dying. And we also have to look at how do we manage our own grief as professionals, individually and collectively. Now, some people have their own top, ways of exercise, chocolate. That's my number one. Talking with a trusted friend or peer who understands, music, nature, journaling. But it's also ceremony. I know in hospice very often each week we would talk about the patients who died. We'd put a rock in a jar and talk about what we learned from them, what they meant to us. It was a way of honoring them and also sharing our grief and our stories. And there was a nursing home in Tucson that was really wonderful, I thought. When they had a resident who died, rather than just empty the room and fill it up again, they kept it open for at least a day. They put out the residents' belongings and they draped the door of the room, and they encouraged other residents and staff to come in and spend time. And they'd share their stories and talk about who this person was. It was a wonderful way to honor them. And secondarily, the other residents learned that when it was their time, they would be equally honored. So what a wonderful gift that was to everybody, to bring grief out in the open, to not hide it, and to fill it up. So what about families? Oh my gosh, nobody goes through any of this by themselves. And the impact on families and how they can impact decision-making is something we really have to be careful of. Because they may say something like, you have to get more treatment, Mom, you're all we have left. Dad died a year ago. I can't go on without you, dear. We've been married for too many years. How will we survive as a family with no income? Not uncommon that the person who's dying had a social security check that everyone was living on. Those are realities. Or you wanted to attend graduation weddings, so you have to hold on. So sometimes there's a push to continue treatment, even if it may not be for the benefit of the patient because of grief, loss, fear, and personal. So we really have to spend time debriefing the family and talk to them. They're not bad. They're dealing with their grief and loss. So start with, help me understand. Help me understand why you want more treatment. Help me understand your concerns, because that allows them to bring out their grief and their fears and finally get to the point where everyone's on the same page, that you all want the best care for this person that you love. But you have to listen first and process that grief. So let me talk about preventing or minimizing some complicated grief. And the only thing harder than talking about dying is not talking about it. When we are not talking about it, preparing it, we can really make it difficult for families who are grieving. So let me talk about Karen. Karen was 32 years old, and she had a very aggressive breast cancer. And the physician, the oncologist, called me in hospice and said, I'm admitting her today. I want you to go and admit her to the hospice unit tomorrow. And I said, well, I can go see her this afternoon. That's no problem. And he goes, no, I want to give her some chemotherapy. I thought, uh-oh. So I just kind of went over to the unit anyway. Karen was pretty much out of it because she was very, very sick. And I spoke to the mother, and she told me about Karen. Now, Karen's belief was as long as chemotherapy was offered, that meant there was hope of more life. And as long as there was hope, she didn't want to jinx it by talking about or preparing for the end of life. This made it difficult because she had a 9-year-old son and she was estranged from a very abusive husband. So no one was allowed to talk about end of life because, by gosh, she was going to get chemotherapy. This is very painful. She got her chemotherapy. She went into a coma. We transferred her to the hospice unit where she died the next day. She had no closure between her and her son. She had made no arrangements between her son to keep him protected from his father. There was no closure with the mother who watched her daughter die without any of that. So very painful if we're not talking and preparing and giving them some choices about how they want to deal with their end of life and preparing them. Contrast this to Sharon. She had mycosis fungoides, which was a very rare aggressive cancer back in the day. And she was in her 30s, but she knew she was dying. We were honest about that. We didn't have any more treatments. So rather than just be sad, she invested her time to say, I want to leave a legacy, because she had 3 little kids she wasn't going to see grow up. So she wrote them letters, special letters for events, Sweet 16, when you get married, when you go to college, and she took pictures so they could carry Sharon with them through their life. They could feel the mother's love. She knew that her love was going to follow them. That was a wonderful way for her to get her own closure, to say, I'm still going to make a difference here, even though I will not be with them. What a wonderful thing to do, but you're not going to be able to help people do that if they don't know they're dealing with end of life. Just because someone's dying doesn't mean somebody failed. The failure is not preparing, facilitating communication, saying goodbye, by avoiding the truth and not having informed choice. So for me, one key to avoid complicated grief is preparation. It is talking about the changes that are going to be coming up. Because to me, this is the most painful thing that people can say, and I heard it way too many times: if I had only known. If I had only known. So preparing for the losses related to disease progression is so important, so that expectations can be modified. They know what's normal and not normal, and what are the key points along the way of the progression of an illness. Otherwise, again, it can make for a very complicated grief at the end of life. Let me talk about Danny and his parents. I was on call in hospice, and I got a frantic call from the parents. Danny was 15 years old, and he had very advanced osteogenic sarcoma. And they were upset and they were angry, and they said, you've got to come out here, you've got to put a feeding tube in. Danny's not doing what he needs to do. He's acting out, he's trying to avoid us. He was 15. He was avoiding us by taking his pain medication so he can just zone out, and he's refusing to eat and refusing to get up. And we were told that he needs to eat and get strong so he can continue his parents. So they thought that his reactions were simply rebellion on his part because he was 15. And for them, they wanted the best for Danny, but this is a very difficult situation. But here's the bad news. When I got out there, it was really apparent. Danny wasn't acting out. Danny was actively dying. When I got there, he could barely sit up, and they were trying to force food into his mouth, but he was barely awake, and he couldn't even swallow. He was choking on that. He could hardly sit up. He was just trying to lean back. And I had to tell him that Danny was dying, that trying to make him eat or trying to make him move was actually going to increase his discomfort, and certainly withholding his pain medications. And his parents were devastated. They said, we didn't know. We thought he wouldn't do it. We didn't know he couldn't do it. And now he was actively dying. And they felt so bad that they didn't know, and that they had contributed to the discomfort of his final day on earth. So that's why we need to prepare people for what to expect so they can manage their expectations and not mislead them in any way. So when someone is dying, we really want to promote some powerful last memories, and some of that is about touch. I can remember walking down a hall one day, and I was looking in the room of a woman, and her husband of 70 years was dying, and she was sitting on the side of the bed, and her hands over the bed rail holding his hand, and she was hurting. And I said, "Do you want to climb up there and hold him?" She's like, "Oh, yes." I said, "Do that." So she held the love of her life while he was dying. What an important memory for her. And how wonderful for him to be embraced in that love while he was dying. Now, did that take away the pain of death? Absolutely not. But what an important memory for her that she got to hold the love of her life while he was dying. Now, we do that naturally for mothers losing babies. But I got to tell you, if I'm 90 years old and it's my 7-year-old son who's dying, that's still my baby. So encourage them to hold them. The other thing to do is, what I recognize in hospice is that a lot of people carry a lot of guilt about, I wasn't there at the time of death. Oh my gosh, I should have been there. So I warn them ahead of time. People choose their time to die. If you're supposed to be there, you will. If you're not supposed to be there, you won't. There is no judgment on that. Some people wait for somebody to show up. Some people wait for somebody to leave. It doesn't mean you're good or bad for either way. And it also doesn't define your relationship for a lifetime for how you spend those last minutes. The shared life you had is a shared life you have, and that's what you need to honor. Now, since I've used up time, I'm going to skip one of my stories about this, but we can talk later about that. So how we help manage a death, find meaning, and accept the natural process of mystery has a real influence on the resulting grieving process of our families. We really need to pay attention to. That means we're tending to our own grief, our honesty, how we deal with the grief of the family and for the patient themselves. So we really want to incorporate the lessons. The 5 things Dr. Biab says before we die is to say, I love you, I forgive you, will you forgive me, thank you, and goodbye. But the first 5 things we should be doing all the time, and that's what my patients have taught me. I don't know when somebody's going to die, so I can tell you very honestly that if anyone in my life dies today, there's nothing left unsaid because I've told them how I feel. Or that if I die, they know that there's nothing left undone. So something you can do today is write out by hand, not email, not typing, what I love about you, what I've learned from you, what my wish is for you. Express it now. Why wait until the end of life? Because you may not get that chance. Be gentle with yourselves. I'm going to skip another slide here. Grief is the last act of love we have to give to those we love. Where there is deep grief, there was great love. Bottom line. When I can't hold you in my arms, I'll hold you in my heart. So let me open this up for questions, comments, sharing that anyone has.
Tani, thank you so much for that presentation. Again, it never gets old, and I've known you for 10 years. I don't want to age us at all, but I've known you for a long time, and you always give a lot of valuable information. So I have a lot of questions. I kind of want to have a little bit of a dialogue with you. Going back to the beginning of your presentation, you talked about you talked about helplessness and powerlessness, and I just wondered if you could provide a few practical ways to deal with that.
Again, it's finding out what you do and do not have control over. You can't control the fact that you have a diagnosis you didn't like or someone you love has a diagnosis. But what can you do with it moving forward? How can you provide the support? How can you provide the information? How can you simply be present? Because you also don't want to be directive and say, well, hey, this website says this and that. You'll drive them crazy. But be present and figure out how can I best be of support to you, to feel like you're doing something. Maybe it's even just providing food, taking their dog on a walk, checking in with them every week. What does that look like for that person? So it's going to be pretty individualized, I think.
Right, and based on your role, either the patient, the one going through the illness, or the caregiver. So that definitely makes sense. You also talked about how to share your grief and to be vulnerable. And I think that that's can be a very challenging thing for anybody in any role. So finding that person that you could share your experience with or share your vulnerability with. What if you don't have that person? And I hate to bring up COVID because, but it is what it is. And a lot of people do feel isolated. So how do you find a person if you don't really have someone in mind, or you don't have somebody in your life that is that person?
Join a grief support group, because sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers anyway, and they understand kind of what the process is that you're going through. Or you might even just find a counselor, because part of the grief processing is you got to tell your story again and again and again and again and again and again. So there's a lot of online support groups now, especially with COVID, for folks to help them process that grief.
And then, it made me start thinking about maybe there's people that are important in my life, and but maybe they've avoided me during a certain situation, during treatment, or any other situation that could be applicable to life. How do I re-engage with my friends or people who may not have been there during my time of grief? But it's like I don't want to say I've moved on, right? You move forward. I wrote that down. I really like that. So how do I re-engage with people that may not have been there with me through my grief?
Yeah, and realize they didn't do it to be mean, but because they don't have the skill set or they're really uncomfortable. So it may be you reaching out and just saying, hey, I miss you. Can we meet or can we chat? And that gives them permission to say, okay, I can talk, because now they're upset thinking, oh, she's going to be really angry with me and she'll never want to talk with me again because I wasn't there. But by you being the one reaching out saying, I miss you, can I tell you what it's been like for me? Here's the things I miss about you. Here's the support. And that just opens up the dialogue and invites them back in your life. There's some people who may never be comfortable doing that, but most people are. They just don't have a way back in, and you may have to provide it yourself.
Right. So talking about open communication and dialogue, I think one thing you've actually presented on this on a previous webinar and at some of our conferences. But how do you get everyone on the same page about making decisions about end of life? And how do you get your family and your healthcare team and everyone on the same page?
Well, and what's true is not everyone may get on the same page, but you do your best to facilitate. You give everybody a chance to talk and to share their stories, because it's about sharing the stories. And when they tell their stories, they're also revealing what their source is. Is it fear? Is it grief? Is it the unknown? What are the things that you can correct? And then again, talking about help me understand, what are the real goals here? What are we going to expect here? We all want the best for this person. What is that going to look like? But that may take some time to get everybody there, because people also arrive at those places at different times. And how they process their own grief and fear will have its own timing. So to think that we can all come together for a quick kumbaya decision making quickly probably isn't going to happen, but it could. But that you've given them an ear, that you've listened to them, that really helps.
I have a specific question actually from Patricia, who joined us on this call. So she's a social worker for cancer patients, and she's done some individual counseling with them. She has one patient in particular who's moved to a new location after 25 years. She's very active. She's had a mastectomy. She's now experiencing reactions to the pandemic, and she's having lots of anxiety. She did not connect that with grief until this presentation. And so she was asking, what would you suggest about this, for this patient with her anxiety?
Again, it's going to be pretty individualized, but I think it's just opening a general dialogue. What has this been like for you? You're in a new place. What do you miss the most? What do you fear the most? Just engage and allow the issues to kind of come to the fore, and say, and now what are the alternatives? What can we do to deal with that? Are there certain people that you miss? Do you have access to a computer? Can you Skype? Can you write letters? But it begins with the dialogue of, help me understand, what has this been like for you?
Okay.
You know, we're all struggling with COVID. Even the most normal, professional, phenomenal people are angry and anxious and depressed. And I think normalizing that is also important, that they're not alone, because we're all feeling it.
Right, right. I know I wrote that down, this new normal, which in the cancer industry we've heard for so many years, right? And then the job loss, and then losing loved ones due to the illness during this period and not being able to see them and say their goodbyes. I've had a few friends actually in that situation. What would you say to those who are loved ones left behind, still going through the pandemic, but were unable to be with their loved ones in their last hour? What could we do to celebrate them and have some closure?
That one's going to be tough. And again, this is the helpless part.
Right.
Just acknowledge the grief. What was this like for you? How was it getting closure? Some people, if they weren't there, can do letter writing to the person who died afterwards. What was it that you would like to have said and done? And sometimes just being able to externalize that and share that, and depending on their belief system, to feel maybe that person is aware, but remind them that that person shared an entire life with them. They understood the restrictions, so that end does not reflect that relationship. But it's just going to be darn painful, and just, what was this like for you? And write it up. There's that damn magic word lacking, is again, that magic wand just isn't there.
Right. So many great points. I just literally, I kept writing down, you don't move on, you move forward. And then I love that exercise of what I love about you, what I've learned from you, and what I wish for you. I think that that's something that, like you said, any person could apply to their daily life, right? And gratitude for our loved ones around us. So I think that's great. Hey, Kel, I know we're coming up on our hour, and I want to see if there's any additional questions that you might have.
Hey. So first of all, I need to admit, I guess I really needed this session with you, Tani, because I found myself kind of tearing up a lot during that. And I'm very thankful that you just talked about that cumulative grief. And I think, unfortunately, during this time, a lot of people are getting hit with multiple loved ones and losing them right now. And so I know for me personally, like, it was beneficial to hear you talk about that, and also just discussing finding that closure in a new way, because we haven't been able to gather and celebrate those lives. And so on a personal note, just thank you for your words and for just speaking to that. And then this is a question that we received from a registrant. And this is kind of going back to when you were discussing anger. But for those that are trying to work through that anger, have you ever, and what are your thoughts on some sort of physical outlet? They were asking particularly about rage rooms. I don't know if you've heard about this. So they just want to hear kind of your 2 cents. What are your thoughts about some sort of physical outlet for anger?
Absolutely. Whether it's jogging, whether it is actually supposed to be very satisfying, is throwing glass against a wall and listening to it shatter. Paintballs. I mean, some of those things, it's okay to be angry. It feels like it's violence, but it's a way of externalizing that anger. It's not, I'm supposed to be nice and sweet and internalize, like, no, I am angry. And express the anger before you get into something else. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So rage room is great. We just don't have it here in Tucson, so I wouldn't have thought about that.
Very good. Well, that was kind of the only question.
And writing letters to the cancer. I am really pissed off at you, and this is why, and this is what I want to do. So that's another way.
Yeah.
It's physical, but it's the emotional way. So sorry.
Yeah. No. Thank you for giving more insight. You covered all the other questions that I had written down in your presentation, and then from what you and Natalie discussed. So that was all I had. Natalie, do you have any more?
It was such a great presentation. Excited to Tani.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to close us today. Tani, thank you so much again for your time in preparation and also just being here with us this morning. And then we are continuing our Survive and Thrive webinar series. So our next live webinar is scheduled for August 11th, and we are excited. The Texas Oncology Medical Panel has agreed to come back with us, and so be on the lookout for more updates on that and more details. Also, like us on Facebook. Go follow our Facebook page. We are doing a lot more live and watch parties on there. And so go there. You can see last week, Dr. Sabrina Mikan was with us talking about sleep and cognition. And so you can find that on our timeline. But then also be looking forward to August 6th, we are going to be sharing about integrative oncology. And so be on the lookout for more details about that and join us for those live Facebook sessions. So Tani, thank you again. We loved having you.
Thank you for doing an amazing job in support of your community. It is awesome and humbling. So thank you for inviting me too.
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.